Power never belongs to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the one whose signature can change the future after everyone else believes the meeting is over. At exactly 8:15 a.m. on a crisp Monday morning, the glass walls of Pierce Global headquarters reflected the Manhattan skyline in flawless blue, while black executive sedans lined the private entrance beneath polished steel canopies. Inside the 47th floor boardroom, sunlight spilled across a 40-foot walnut conference table surrounded by leather chairs reserved for people who believe they controlled billions of dollars with a simple vote. Fresh orchids rested beside crystal water glasses, espresso drifted through hidden ventilation, and a digital screen counted down the final 45 minutes before the company's annual governance session. Every financial network in New York expected history to be made before noon. Nathaniel Pierce welcomed directors with the confidence of a man who had spent 2 decades convincing the world that Pierce Global existed because of his vision alone. His charcoal suit fit with effortless precision, a platinum watch rested beneath his cuff, and every smile had been rehearsed long before the cameras arrived. Investors admired him. Analysts praised him. Even the newest executives lowered their voices whenever he entered a room. Nathan believed visibility was authority, and authority, once earned, could never be questioned. Across the room, Claire Kensington stood beside the panoramic windows wearing a tailored ivory business suit that reflected the morning light with understated luxury. She greeted senior directors with practiced confidence, accepting compliments she had never truly earned, enjoying the subtle shift that came from standing close enough to borrowed power. For months, rumors had quietly spread through executive offices that Claire's influence had grown far beyond her official title. Few people understood how quickly appearances could become accepted as truth inside corporate America. Amara Brooks arrived without an announcement. Her deep burgundy executive suit carried the quiet elegance of old money rather than fashionable trends, and the only jewelry she wore was a simple platinum watch inherited from her late father. She crossed the marble floor without rushing, acknowledging no whispers, demanding no attention. Yet conversations softened as she passed, because real authority rarely needed introductions. Most employees knew her only as Nathan's wife. Very few remembered she had helped build the company's earliest governance structure before Pierce Global became a Wall Street success story. Nathan barely looked in her direction. Instead, he handed a sealed cream envelope to Claire with the casual confidence of someone distributing routine paperwork. "You'll represent these interests today," he said, loud enough for several directors to hear. Claire accepted the envelope with a grateful smile, unaware that the embossed corporate seal concealed something far more significant than ordinary meeting documents. One director glanced toward Amara, expecting surprise or protest. None came. Amara simply observed the exchange with the same calm expression she might have worn while studying rainfall through the windows of a Manhattan penthouse. The corporate secretary announced that voting materials would be verified in exactly 30 minutes. Nathan laughed lightly, assuring everyone the board would move faster than ever before. Several directors nodded. Financial reporters gathered outside the executive floor, preparing headlines celebrating another year of Nathan's leadership. Claire rested her fingertips on the unopened envelope, believing she had just stepped into the highest circle of influence the company could offer. No one noticed Amara quietly studying the small line printed beneath the corporate seal, or the almost invisible space where one final authorization signature should have appeared. In a company built on ownership, contracts, and governance, the smallest blank space on a single document could eventually become the most expensive silence anyone in that room would ever witness. The corporate secretary accepted the cream envelope from Claire Kensington with a courteous nod before placing it on a polished leather portfolio reserved for proxy verification. No one questioned the exchange because confidence has a way of disguising irregularities inside rooms built for powerful people. Around the walnut table, independent directors reviewed thick governance binders, while assistants quietly distributed updated financial packets embossed with silver lettering. Outside the boardroom, television crews waited behind velvet barriers, eager to report another effortless victory for Nathaniel Pierce before the opening bell on Wall Street. Inside, Nathan moved through conversations with the ease of a man who believed every smile in the building had already been purchased years ago. He stopped beside Claire, adjusting the sleeve of his tailored jacket before speaking softly enough to sound personal, but loudly enough for nearby executives to hear. He reminded her that the proxy would allow her to speak with confidence if questions arose during the governance session. Claire smiled with visible pride, believing the document represented trust rather than borrowed authority. Several vice presidents exchanged quick glances, surprised that someone with relatively little corporate history had suddenly become so central to the morning. Nathan welcomed their curiosity. Public perception often mattered more to him than legal precision. Across the room, Amara Brooks accepted a porcelain espresso cup from an attendant and quietly thanked him before taking a seat near the far end of the conference table. She did not request the chair traditionally reserved for the founder's family. She allowed someone else to occupy it without objection. Her silence unsettled one elderly director more than any argument could have. He remembered the early years, when Amara spent long evenings drafting governance language beside outside counsel, while Nathan traveled from one investor meeting to another. The company had grown into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, but paper had always carried more authority than applause. At precisely 8:42 a.m., the corporate secretary began collecting every proxy authorization for verification before the official meeting. One by one, folders crossed the table with practiced efficiency. Claire carefully opened the cream envelope Nathan had given her only minutes earlier. Inside rested an elegant proxy certificate bearing embossed seals, executive signatures, and language that appeared flawless at first glance. She held it with quiet satisfaction, convinced she had finally crossed an invisible line separating trusted executive from future leader. Nathan noticed several directors watching her and offered an easy smile, enjoying the impression that his inner circle had become stronger than ever. Amara lifted her eyes only once, not toward Claire, but toward the document itself. She noticed the placement of the signatures, the alignment of the certification stamp, and the empty authorization line hidden beneath the final paragraph, where very few people ever looked. Her expression never changed. The secretary reached for the certificate, placed it on the verification stack, and continued without hesitation. Nathan leaned back comfortably, convinced every important decision had already been made before the meeting officially began. Around him, crystal glasses reflected the Manhattan skyline, while market numbers climbed across silent display screens. The room carried the reassuring rhythm of wealth, procedure, and certainty. Yet somewhere beneath layers of polished governance language, one incomplete signature waited with extraordinary patience. And like every overlooked clause written to protect ownership rather than ego, it required nothing more than time before it transformed confidence into consequence. At exactly 9 a.m., the governance session officially began as the heavy walnut doors closed and the outside noise of reporters, assistants, and financial commentators disappeared behind soundproof glass. The room settled into the quiet rhythm that only billion-dollar decisions could create. The corporate secretary called each agenda item with precise professionalism, while digital displays projected voting thresholds, shareholder participation percentages, and committee recommendations across 3 floor-to-ceiling screens. Nathaniel Pierce appeared completely at ease. He welcomed every motion with polished confidence, answered routine questions without hesitation, and occasionally exchanged approving smiles with Claire Kensington, whose place at the executive table seemed more accepted with every passing minute. To many directors, the transition looked natural. Influence often arrived gradually before anyone realized authority had quietly changed hands. When the secretary announced the first governance resolution requiring proxy participation, Claire reached for the certificate that Nathan had entrusted to her earlier that morning. She rose gracefully from her chair, thanked the board for its confidence, and spoke with carefully rehearsed composure about leadership continuity, long-term growth, and responsible governance. Her voice carried clearly through the boardroom, earning respectful nods from several newer directors who had never witnessed the company's earliest years. Nathan watched with unmistakable satisfaction, allowing Claire to exercise the proxy before the entire board accomplished far more than a procedural vote. It sent a public message that she belonged among the company's most trusted decision-makers. Every approving glance reinforced the image he wanted investors, executives, and independent directors to remember. Across the room, Amara Brooks remained perfectly still, making no effort to interrupt the presentation or challenge Claire's authority. She reviewed the printed governance binder resting before her, as though today's meeting differed little from dozens she had attended over the years. Her calm composure puzzled one veteran director, Richard Holloway, who quietly remembered seeing Amara draft governance amendments long before Pierce Global occupied a Manhattan skyscraper overlooking Central Park. He glanced toward her several times, expecting concern or disappointment. Instead, he found only thoughtful silence. Claire completed the proxy statement and handed the certificate to the corporate secretary for formal recording. The secretary accepted it with practiced efficiency before placing the document inside a dark blue verification folder that would later become part of the company's permanent governance archive. Nathan leaned back comfortably, folded his hands, and thanked Claire for representing what he described as an important shareholder interest. Several executives responded with polite applause. The atmosphere inside the room grew lighter, almost celebratory. It felt as though the morning had already confirmed Nathan's complete control over both the company and the people surrounding him. While conversations shifted toward strategic acquisitions and international expansion, the deputy corporate secretary quietly reviewed each submitted authorization before transferring it into the official record. His eyes paused for only a moment on Claire's certificate. Something about the formatting seemed unfamiliar. The certification language matched company policy. The embossed seal appeared authentic. The executive signatures looked correct. Yet one reference number printed beneath the authorization paragraph directed him toward an appendix that did not appear inside the governance binder issued for today's meeting. He frowned briefly before making a discreet notation in the margin with a graphite pencil, intending to verify the reference after the next voting session concluded. No one noticed the tiny mark except Amara, whose eyes drifted toward the folder for less than a second before returning to the skyline beyond the glass. Nathan interpreted her silence as acceptance. Claire interpreted it as defeat. Neither realized that the smallest unanswered reference inside a governance document could sometimes carry more weight than every confident speech delivered around the boardroom table. By 9:24 a.m., the atmosphere inside the boardroom had shifted from careful procedure to quiet celebration. The largest governance resolutions had passed without visible resistance. Investment projections filled the presentation screens with record growth, and several directors openly congratulated Nathaniel Pierce on what one investment banker described as another defining year for Pierce Global. Crystal coffee cups were replaced with sparkling water, handwritten notes gave way to confident smiles, and the tension that normally accompanied billion-dollar decisions gradually dissolved beneath the reassuring rhythm of apparent success. Nathan accepted every compliment with measured humility that had been perfected over years of shareholder meetings, although the satisfaction in his eyes revealed something deeper. He believed the morning had accomplished more than strong corporate governance. He believed he had permanently changed the balance of influence inside the company. Claire Kensington now occupied the center of executive conversations. Directors who had rarely acknowledged her before the meeting suddenly asked for her opinion regarding expansion opportunities, leadership succession, and international partnerships. She answered carefully, echoing Nathan's strategic language with growing confidence. Every approving nod encouraged her to believe that authority could be transferred as easily as recognition. Near the panoramic windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan, Amara Brooks quietly reviewed the quarterly governance packet while sunlight reflected across the polished marble floor. She neither interrupted discussions nor responded to the subtle glances directed toward her from across the table. Her silence became its own presence. To several younger executives, it appeared she had accepted a diminished role. To Richard Holloway, however, her composure suggested something entirely different. He had spent more than 25 years serving on public company boards, and he had learned that experienced founders rarely reacted before understanding every consequence. Meanwhile, in the administrative office adjoining the boardroom, the deputy corporate secretary continued organizing the official governance archive before filing the completed proxy documentation. Company policy required every authorization certificate to be cross-referenced against historical governance records before permanent registration. The process was usually routine. Yet the handwritten notation he had made earlier continued to bother him. He entered the reference number printed beneath Claire's authorization into the secure governance database. Within seconds, an older document appeared on his monitor. Instead of opening a current proxy schedule, the reference directed him toward an archived appendix created nearly 11 years earlier during the company's original restructuring. He frowned. That appendix had not been included in today's board materials. Believing the omission was probably administrative rather than significant, he requested the archived file from the digital records vault. The retrieval system estimated less than 2 minutes. Back inside the boardroom, Nathan announced a short recess before the afternoon strategy session. Several directors stood to admire the skyline, while reporters outside prepared optimistic market updates based on information already shared by investor relations. Claire accepted congratulations with gracious confidence, convinced the difficult part of the day had ended. Nathan quietly told her that after today's meeting, everyone would understand exactly where the future leadership of the company was heading. She smiled with unmistakable pride. Across the room, Amara slowly closed her governance binder and looked toward the polished walnut table where the proxy certificate had rested only minutes before. Her expression remained unchanged, almost thoughtful, as though she had been waiting for the company to remember something it had written long before anyone in the room had begun celebrating. In the adjoining records office, the archived appendix finally appeared on the deputy secretary's screen, and the first sentence immediately caused him to stop reading aloud and reach instead for the direct extension of the governance committee chair. The call reached Margaret Ellison before the board members returned from recess. As chair of the governance committee, she had spent 3 decades building a reputation for one simple principle. Personal influence ended where corporate bylaws began. She listened without interruption while the deputy corporate secretary explained the unusual reference number and the archived appendix that had unexpectedly surfaced inside the record system. Margaret asked only one question. Has anyone altered the historical archive? The answer came immediately. No. Every document remained protected by the company's permanent governance registry, complete with digital timestamps dating back more than a decade. She thanked him, instructed him to print the appendix on secured paper, and quietly walked toward the executive floor, carrying a slim charcoal folder instead of joining the directors in the hospitality lounge. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Pierce stood beside the panoramic windows accepting congratulations from investment bankers, independent analysts, and senior executives. A financial journalist had already requested an interview after the meeting, expecting another confident discussion about leadership and expansion. Nathan accepted with the relaxed certainty of a man who believed the day had unfolded exactly as planned. Claire Kensington stood nearby speaking with several directors who now treated her as though she had always belonged within the company's highest circle. Someone joked that she looked more comfortable in the boardroom than many long-serving executives. Laughter followed. Claire smiled politely, unaware that every compliment rested upon a document whose legal foundation had not yet survived formal review. Across the room, Amara Brooks quietly admired the Manhattan skyline stretching beyond the glass walls. Afternoon sunlight reflected from neighboring towers, casting silver patterns across the polished marble floor. She accepted a fresh cup of coffee from an attendant and thanked him with the same calm courtesy she had shown throughout the morning. Nathan noticed her standing alone and approached with measured confidence. He lowered his voice, careful to sound gracious rather than dismissive. He told her that difficult changes often accompanied successful companies and suggested she should appreciate the organization's willingness to embrace the future. Amara listened without interruption. She looked at him with quiet composure before answering with only a single sentence. The future usually remembers who wrote the rules. Nathan smiled politely, interpreting her words as reluctant acceptance rather than quiet certainty. Before he could respond, Margaret Ellison entered the boardroom carrying the charcoal folder beneath one arm. Her arrival immediately changed the atmosphere. Directors returned to their seats without being asked. The deputy corporate secretary followed close behind, placing a newly printed appendix beside Margaret's leather portfolio. She remained standing instead of sitting at the head of the table. That small decision alone was enough to silence every private conversation. Nathan welcomed her with practiced confidence, assuming she intended to begin the afternoon strategy session. Instead, Margaret opened the charcoal folder and carefully compared the archived appendix with the proxy certificate submitted earlier that morning. Her eyes moved slowly across each page before stopping at a paragraph highlighted by the records office. The room remained perfectly still. Finally, she closed both documents, looked toward the corporate secretary, and requested that the proxy verification process be temporarily suspended until one historical governance requirement could be independently confirmed. Nathan's confident expression barely changed, but several directors exchanged uncertain glances. Claire looked toward the certificate resting on the polished walnut table for the first time that day, and although she still did not understand what had changed, the confidence she had carried throughout the morning suddenly felt less certain than it had only a few minutes before. Silence settled over the executive floor with a weight that no quarterly report could explain. Outside the glass walls, helicopters crossed the Manhattan skyline, and the stock market continued moving through another ordinary trading day, completely unaware that the most important decision inside Pierce Global had quietly stopped moving forward. Margaret Ellison opened the archived appendix and placed it beside the proxy certificate with deliberate precision. She did not raise her voice, and she did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. Years of corporate governance had taught her that facts carried far more authority than emotion. She asked the deputy corporate secretary to read the appendix reference exactly as it appeared in the original restructuring record. His voice remained steady as he read each line aloud. The document stated that every founder-level voting proxy connected to the original Pierce Global Governance Trust required 3 independent conditions before becoming legally effective. The first required execution by the registered shareholder. The second required certification by the corporate secretary. The third required written acknowledgement from the designated trustee responsible for preserving founder governance rights. The room became noticeably quieter. Nathaniel Pierce leaned forward and calmly replied that all necessary approvals had already been handled through executive administration. Margaret looked toward the deputy secretary instead of answering Nathan directly. The younger man carefully turned another page from the archived file before speaking again. According to the Permanent Governance Registry, the designated trustee had never submitted an acknowledgement for the proxy presented that morning. Claire Kensington looked toward Nathan with growing uncertainty. Only moments earlier she had believed the document represented unquestionable authority. Now every sentence being read seemed to move that certainty farther away. Nathan maintained his composed expression and explained that administrative acknowledgments were often completed after board meetings as part of ordinary governance housekeeping. Several executives nodded, wanting his explanation to be true. Margaret did not disagree. Instead, she requested the certified trustee register maintained by the company's outside governance custodian. Within minutes, a secure digital tablet arrived from the records office. She unlocked the protected archive using a governance authentication code known only to committee leadership and the corporate secretary. The screen displayed the original founder governance trust established 11 years earlier during Pierce Global's restructuring. Richard Holloway quietly removed his reading glasses as the names appeared. The first pages listed Nathan's executive authority, board responsibilities, and shareholder obligations. Nothing seemed unusual until Margaret reached the final trustee designation. She stopped scrolling. The room waited. She slowly rotated the tablet toward the corporate secretary and asked him to verify the registered trustee of every founder-level voting authorization created under the restructuring agreement. He studied the screen carefully before reading the name exactly as written in the permanent record. Amara Brooks. No title followed the name. No honorary designation. Simply the registered trustee with exclusive authority to activate or validate every founder governance proxy issued under the trust. Claire's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Nathan remained silent for the first time that day. Across the polished walnut table, Amara neither smiled nor reacted. She simply folded her hands beside her untouched coffee cup and looked toward the skyline as though she had heard nothing unexpected. Margaret closed the tablet and spoke with quiet professionalism. Until the trustee confirmed whether any acknowledgement had ever been granted, the proxy could not be recognized as fully effective under the original governance framework. Around the room, directors who had celebrated only minutes earlier began reopening their governance binders, suddenly aware that the company they believed they understood had been operating under rules far older and far more carefully written than most of them had ever imagined. No one spoke for several long seconds after the trustee designation was read into the official record. The silence felt heavier than any shareholder vote because it carried something that could not be negotiated. It carried history. Nathaniel Pierce slowly folded his hands on the polished walnut table, maintaining the calm expression that had reassured investors for years. He reminded the board that Pierce Global had completed countless governance actions since the restructuring without interruption and suggested that the committee was elevating an administrative technicality into an unnecessary distraction. His voice remained smooth, measured, and confident. Margaret Ellison listened without interrupting. When he finished, she simply requested that the deputy corporate secretary retrieve the complete founder governance trust file rather than the abbreviated appendix. Within moments, another secured archive appeared on the encrypted tablet. The digital record contained more than 400 pages, each protected by permanent authentication logs dating back 11 years. Margaret carefully navigated to the trustee provisions while Richard Holloway quietly leaned forward, reading each page over the edge of his glasses. The language was unmistakably precise. Every founder-level proxy existed as a temporary instrument rather than an independent transfer of authority. Without written trustee acknowledgement, the proxy could be prepared, presented, and even physically delivered, but it could never become an active governance instrument. Claire Kensington looked down at the certificate resting beside her notebook as though seeing it for the first time. The elegant paper, embossed seal, and executive signatures had made it appear complete. Now it looked strangely unfinished. Nathan asked whether the trustee acknowledgement had perhaps been filed separately years ago during an earlier governance review. Margaret immediately instructed the records office to search every certified amendment, supplemental authorization, board resolution, and trustee correspondence connected to the Founder Governance Trust. The search extended through archived servers, secured document vaults, and physical governance inventories maintained by the company's outside custodian. Nearly 10 minutes passed while directors remained seated in complete silence. Outside the boardroom, sunlight continued to flood the Manhattan skyline. Reporters continued preparing optimistic market updates, and employees throughout the headquarters celebrated what they believed had been another successful governance meeting. Inside the room, every passing minute seemed to erase a little more certainty. Finally, the deputy corporate secretary received a secured response from the outside governance custodian. He opened the report, reviewed it twice, and carefully slid the printed confirmation across the table to Margaret. She read only the final paragraph before placing the document beside the original trust agreement. According to the permanent custody records, no trustee acknowledgement had ever been executed, submitted, archived, amended, or waived since the day the restructuring agreement became effective. The report further confirmed that no alternate trustee had ever been appointed and no board resolution possessed authority to override that requirement. Every founder proxy remained legally dependent upon a single living trustee. Margaret slowly lifted her eyes toward Amara Brooks. Amara met her gaze with the same quiet composure she had carried throughout the morning. She neither celebrated nor appeared surprised. She simply reached into her burgundy leather portfolio and withdrew a slim cream folder bearing the original silver seal of the Founder Governance Trust. She placed it carefully on the table without opening it. Nathan noticed the seal immediately. Richard Holloway recognized it as well. The folder had not been created recently. Its edges carried the subtle wear of something preserved rather than prepared. For the first time that day, several directors stopped looking at Nathan and began looking toward Amara, realizing that whatever remained inside that unopened folder had likely been waiting for this exact moment long before anyone believed the meeting was already won. Amara Brooks rested her fingertips lightly on the unopened cream folder while every pair of eyes around the polished walnut table remained fixed upon it. She did not rush to explain herself. Years spent inside executive boardrooms had taught her that silence often carried greater authority than the loudest presentation. Margaret Ellison broke the stillness first. She thanked Amara for preserving the original trust records and asked whether the folder contained documents directly related to the Founder Governance Trust referenced in the archived appendix. Amara answered with calm precision. It contained only originals, preserved exactly as they had been executed 11 years earlier. Nathaniel Pierce leaned forward and spoke with measured confidence, insisting that historical paperwork should not delay decisions already supported by the board. He reminded everyone that Pierce Global had become one of the most respected corporations on Wall Street because leadership remained focused on growth rather than technical formalities. Margaret acknowledged his point before replying that governance documents were never technical formalities. They were the legal architecture supporting every decision the company had ever made. Without them, confidence became opinion instead of authority. She invited Amara to place the contents of the folder into the official record. Amara slowly opened the cream folder and removed 3 impeccably preserved documents secured together with a silver archival ribbon. The first was the original Founder Governance Trust. The second was a trustee acceptance certificate bearing a notarized date from the restructuring year. The third was a sealed instruction letter addressed to the governance committee, marked to remain unopened unless a founder-level proxy became disputed. Richard Holloway quietly inhaled as he recognized the signatures of the outside restructuring attorneys who had guided Pierce Global through its earliest expansion. Margaret carefully accepted the instruction letter, examined the intact archival seal, and asked the corporate secretary to verify its authenticity against the company's permanent registry. Within less than 1 minute, the registry confirmed that the seal identification number matched the original filing exactly. No replacement had ever been requested. No amendment had ever been submitted. The letter had remained untouched for more than a decade. Claire Kensington watched every movement without speaking. Until that moment, she had believed the discussion centered only on one incomplete authorization. She now realized the governance framework itself had anticipated a dispute long before she had ever joined the company. Nathan maintained his composed posture, but his attention never left the sealed letter. Margaret requested permission from the board to open the archived instruction in accordance with the conditions specified by the trust. Every independent director voted in favor without hesitation. The ribbon was carefully removed, and the heavy cream envelope opened with deliberate precision. Inside rested a single signed instruction on thick cotton paper. Margaret silently read the first page before passing it to Richard Holloway for independent confirmation. He reviewed every line, adjusted his glasses, and slowly looked toward Nathan. The instructions stated that any attempted activation of a founder-level proxy without verified trustee acknowledgement required an immediate governance protection review before additional corporate votes could proceed. It further instructed the governance committee to suspend reliance upon the disputed proxy until trustee authority had been conclusively determined under the original trust. Margaret closed the document and addressed the board with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the meeting. Effective immediately, the governance session would enter formal protection review. No additional proxy-dependent resolutions would be recognized until the Founder Governance Trust completed its required verification process. The celebration that had filled the room less than an hour earlier disappeared without a single raised voice, replaced by the unmistakable realization that the company was no longer following Nathan's schedule. It was following rules written years before anyone imagined this morning would ever arrive. The boardroom no longer felt like the center of a successful annual meeting. It felt like a vault that had quietly unlocked a forgotten history. Afternoon lights stretched across the Manhattan skyline, reflecting through the glass walls onto the polished walnut table where the original trust documents now rested beside the modern governance binders. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One represented current leadership. The other represented the foundation that had made current leadership possible. Margaret Ellison requested that the corporate secretary continue reviewing every document connected to the Founder Governance Trust before any additional business proceeded. The secretary carefully opened another archived record retrieved from the Secure Governance Registry. It was labeled Founder Ownership Schedule. Every page had remained digitally preserved since the restructuring 11 years earlier. Richard Holloway reviewed the certification log before quietly confirming that no amendments had ever been filed. Margaret invited the secretary to summarize only the provisions directly affecting governance authority. The secretary adjusted his glasses and began reading. The first provision confirmed that Nathaniel Pierce served as chief executive officer under authority granted by the founder governance structure rather than through unrestricted executive ownership. The second provision identified the founder governance trust as the permanent holder of the company's protected control rights. Several directors exchanged uncertain glances. Nathan remained motionless, listening without interruption. Then the secretary reached the third provision. Certain strategic governance powers, including founder-level voting protection, emergency board review, and activation of protected voting rights, remained exclusively reserved to the registered trustee acting on behalf of the trust. Margaret asked a simple question. Who is identified as the registered trustee? The answer did not change. Amara Brooks. Claire Kensington lowered her eyes toward the polished table. Until now, she had believed the discussion involved only a disputed proxy. She was beginning to understand that the proxy had never been the true source of authority. It had merely pointed toward something much larger. Margaret requested the final ownership schedule attached to the restructuring documents. The secretary carefully turned several pages before reading again. The Founder Governance Trust controlled a protected voting structure commonly described in the accompanying legal memorandum as a founder protection mechanism. Those protected rights could not be reassigned, diluted, or indirectly exercised without trustee authorization, regardless of executive office, shareholder influence, or board recommendation. Richard Holloway quietly nodded. He remembered the restructuring negotiations years earlier when outside counsel warned that rapid corporate growth could eventually place extraordinary pressure on founder control. The trust had been designed to protect the company from that exact possibility. Nathan finally spoke, maintaining the composed confidence that had defined him throughout the morning. He argued that operational leadership had always rested with the chief executive officer and that the company had prospered under that arrangement for more than a decade. Margaret acknowledged the success of his leadership before calmly distinguishing operational management from protected governance authority. One directed the business. The other protected the business whenever extraordinary circumstances emerged. Those two responsibilities had intentionally been separated by the restructuring agreement. Amara remained silent. She neither corrected anyone nor expanded upon the documents already speaking for themselves. She simply watched as directors slowly reread pages they had once approved without imagining they might someday govern their own decisions. Outside the executive floor, reporters continued discussing quarterly earnings and anticipated leadership announcements. Inside the boardroom, however, the conversation had moved beyond earnings entirely. It had become a question of ownership, responsibility, and the quiet architecture of authority that had existed long before today's meeting. Margaret gently closed the final ownership schedule and looked around the table before speaking with measured clarity. We now understand where the governance authority resides. The remaining question is whether the trustee intends to activate the protections that these documents have preserved for more than 11 years. Every director instinctively turned toward Amara Brooks, realizing that for the first time all day, the future of Pierce Global no longer depended upon the confidence of its chief executive officer. It depended upon the woman who had never once asked the room to notice her. The question lingered in the boardroom long after Margaret Ellison finished speaking. Every director remained seated, every screen continued displaying market data, and every polished surface reflected the afternoon light pouring across Manhattan. Yet the room no longer belonged to quarterly forecasts or acquisition strategies. It belonged to a decision that had been quietly waiting inside a trust agreement for more than a decade. Amara Brooks looked around the table without urgency. She recognized nearly every director, remembered the expansion meetings that had built the company, and recalled the countless evenings when governance language had been negotiated line by line instead of celebrated in headlines. She had never viewed the Founder Governance Trust as a weapon. It had always been designed as a safeguard. Margaret asked one final time whether the registered trustee intended to exercise any authority provided under the governing documents. Nathaniel Pierce remained composed, although the confidence in his expression had become noticeably restrained. He reminded the board that the company faced sensitive negotiations with institutional investors and that unnecessary governance actions could create uncertainty throughout the financial markets. His words were logical, measured, and persuasive. Several executives quietly nodded. Amara listened carefully before opening her burgundy leather portfolio once more. From inside, She removed a single cream document protected by a transparent archival sleeve. Unlike the earlier trust papers, this document appeared remarkably simple. At the top of the page, beneath the silver seal of the Founder Governance Trust, one title appeared in understated lettering: Trustee Authorization for Governance Protection Review. Margaret accepted the document and reviewed it carefully before handing it to the corporate secretary for authentication. Within moments, the digital verification system confirmed that the authorization template had been filed with the original restructuring documents 11 years earlier and had never previously been activated. Richard Holloway quietly smiled to himself. The architects of the restructuring had anticipated that one day the company might require protection not from outside competitors, but from decisions made within its own executive offices. Amara picked up the company's black fountain pen resting beside her notebook. She did not look toward Nathan. She did not look toward Claire. She simply signed the authorization using the same deliberate handwriting that appeared throughout the original trust records. Her signature was calm, precise, and unmistakable. The sound of the pen leaving the paper echoed through the silent boardroom more clearly than any speech delivered that day. Margaret immediately acknowledged receipt of the executed authorization and instructed the corporate secretary to transmit certified copies to the governance committee, the independent compliance office, the outside corporate custodian, and the board's external legal counsel. The requests were transmitted electronically within less than 60 seconds. Confirmation notices began appearing across the secretary's secure dashboard one after another. Governance protection review activated. Trustee verification accepted. Protected voting structure under review. Claire watched the notifications appear with growing disbelief. No one had raised a voice. No one had accused her of misconduct. Yet the system itself had quietly begun moving beyond everyone's personal influence. Nathan reached for the proxy certificate that had started the morning's celebration, but Margaret gently placed her hand on the document before he could lift it. She explained that all materials connected to the disputed authorization would remain preserved as governance records until the review concluded. Nathan slowly withdrew his hand without argument. Across the polished walnut table, Amara closed her portfolio and folded her hands once again. She had not demanded power. She had simply restored the process that the company itself had promised to follow years before anyone believed confidence alone could replace governance. Outside the headquarters, reporters still prepared stories about executive success. Inside the boardroom, however, the company had quietly begun following a different story altogether, one written not by personalities, but by the enduring authority of its own rules. Less than 3 minutes after the trustee authorization entered the governance system, the first external confirmations began arriving from offices that did not report to Nathaniel Pierce or any executive inside Pierce Global. The outside corporate custodian acknowledged receipt of the activation notice. Independent compliance confirmed that the Founder Governance Trust had entered formal protection review. External legal counsel verified that the trustee authorization satisfied every procedural requirement established during the original restructuring. Each confirmation appeared on the corporate secretary's secure display with precise timestamps, creating an uninterrupted chain of governance events that immediately became part of the company's permanent legal record. Margaret Ellison reviewed every confirmation before directing the secretary to notify the independent directors that the governance committee would now complete the protection review exactly as required by the trust documents. Nathan remained remarkably composed. He reminded the board that operational leadership could not simply pause because historical governance procedures had been activated. Margaret agreed that daily business would continue. However, she explained that decisions affecting protected founder rights now required review under the governance framework that every director had previously accepted upon joining the board. No exception existed for the chief executive officer. Richard Holloway quietly observed the room as attitudes slowly shifted. Earlier that morning, directors had instinctively looked toward Nathan whenever uncertainty appeared. Now they waited for Margaret before speaking and occasionally glanced toward Amara, as though recognizing an authority that had always existed but had remained largely invisible. Claire Kensington remained silent. The confidence that had accompanied her throughout the morning had gradually disappeared without anyone directly confronting her. She realized that every privilege she believed she possessed had depended entirely upon a proxy that no longer carried unquestioned authority. The atmosphere inside the boardroom changed once again when the Independent Compliance Office transmitted its preliminary recommendation. The report concluded that any governance action influenced by the disputed founder proxy should remain temporarily suspended until the review reached its final determination. Margaret immediately placed the recommendation into the official record. Within moments, another notification arrived from the outside governance custodian confirming that the protected voting structure would remain administratively isolated until trustee verification concluded. Nathan looked toward the display as each confirmation appeared. None of the notices criticized his leadership. None accused him of misconduct. They simply reflected the automatic response of systems that had been designed years earlier to operate without emotion or personal preference. Amara quietly watched the notifications arrive one after another. She neither celebrated nor commented. The process unfolding before everyone was not something she controlled moment by moment. It was something the governance structure had been built to perform on its own once properly activated. Margaret then addressed the independent directors directly. She explained that the governance committee had completed its procedural review and now recommended convening an immediate protected session to determine whether executive authority remained fully consistent with the founder governance trust. Every independent director accepted the recommendation without objection. The corporate secretary recorded each acknowledgement while preparing confidential voting materials reserved exclusively for governance protection proceedings. Nathan noticed the distinctive blue folders being distributed around the table. Those folders had not appeared during ordinary board meetings in many years. Richard Holloway quietly remembered seeing them only once before during the original restructuring. They existed for extraordinary circumstances rather than routine corporate business. Outside the headquarters, financial reporters continued expecting an announcement celebrating another successful year of executive leadership. Inside the boardroom, however, the company had quietly reached an entirely different milestone. Personal influence had ended. From that moment forward, every remaining decision would belong not to confidence, reputation, or executive office, but to the governance system that Pierce Global itself had chosen to preserve long before anyone imagined it would one day determine the future of its own leadership. The protected governance session began at exactly 2:18 p.m. After the corporate secretary confirmed that only voting directors, committee counsel, and authorized governance participants remained inside the executive boardroom. The atmosphere had become almost ceremonial. Every blue governance folder rested unopened before the independent directors, while the panoramic windows reflected the late afternoon light spreading across Manhattan's financial district. Margaret Ellison reviewed the procedural requirements one final time before inviting external counsel to summarize the committee's findings. The attorney spoke with quiet precision. The disputed founder proxy had failed to satisfy the mandatory trustee acknowledgement required under the Founder Governance Trust. The attempted exercise of founder-level authority therefore possessed no legal governance effect. Every procedural safeguard established during the restructuring had functioned exactly as designed. No accusation of fraud appeared in the report. No allegation of intentional misconduct appeared either. The conclusion was narrower and, in many ways, more consequential. The governance protections had automatically overridden an unauthorized exercise of protected voting authority. Nathaniel Pierce listened without interruption. He thanked the committee for its thorough review and acknowledged the historical documents that had emerged during the session. He then argued that operational continuity remained the company's highest priority and suggested that any procedural misunderstanding could be corrected through revised governance documentation after the meeting concluded. Several months earlier, that proposal might have ended the discussion. Today it did not. Margaret gently reminded the board that the Founder Governance Trust specifically prohibited retroactive correction of protected governance events after activation had occurred. Once the protection mechanism began operating, the committee was obligated to complete every remaining step exactly as written. Richard Holloway quietly nodded before opening the final blue folder. Inside rested a single resolution prepared by external governance counsel. The resolution recommended that the independent directors determine whether confidence in the current exercise of executive governance authority had been materially affected by the unsuccessful attempt to activate a protected founder proxy without trustee authorization. Margaret instructed the corporate secretary to distribute confidential ballots. No speeches followed. No emotional debate unfolded. Each independent director simply reviewed the written findings, marked a decision, sealed the ballot inside a cream envelope, and returned it to the secretary. Claire Kensington remained seated in complete silence. She understood that nothing she said could influence documents that had governed the company since long before she had entered its executive offices. Amara Brooks remained equally quiet. She watched neither the ballots nor the directors. Instead, she looked through the glass wall toward the skyline where evening light had begun settling over the city that had witnessed the company's entire history. After the final envelope was collected, the corporate secretary counted each ballot under the supervision of Margaret, an outside counsel. The result was reviewed twice before being entered into the permanent governance record. Margaret accepted the certified tally and slowly rose from her chair. Every director looked toward her. Nathan maintained his composure, although the certainty that had accompanied him throughout the morning had quietly disappeared. Margaret announced that the independent directors had adopted the governance resolution by the required supermajority established under the Founder Governance Trust. Effective immediately, Nathaniel Pierce's authority as Chief Executive Officer would be suspended pending appointment of interim executive leadership in accordance with the company's protected governance procedures. The room remained perfectly silent. No applause followed. No celebration emerged. The corporate secretary calmly deactivated Nathan's executive voting credentials within the governance system, while information technology compliance simultaneously confirmed that protected administrative access had been transferred to interim board control. Nathan looked once toward the display where his executive authorization status changed from active to suspended. Across the table, Amara offered no expression of triumph. She had never defeated a person. The system had simply reached the conclusion it had been designed to reach when its own rules were finally allowed to speak. The formal session concluded just before sunset, but no one hurried to leave the boardroom. Beyond the glass walls, Manhattan shimmered beneath golden evening light, while financial news networks continued broadcasting reports prepared hours earlier, unaware that the most important story inside Pierce Global had unfolded in complete silence. The corporate secretary finalized the governance minutes with careful precision, attaching every trust document, every committee finding, every independent recommendation, and every certified resolution to the permanent corporate archive. Once completed, the record could never be altered without unanimous legal authority. Margaret Ellison reviewed the final pages before placing her signature beneath the closing certification. She thanked every director for honoring the governance framework exactly as it had been written. Richard Holloway quietly closed his blue folder, reflecting on the extraordinary irony of the day. The company had not been transformed by a new policy or an unexpected investor. It had simply remembered its own foundation. Nathaniel Pierce remained standing beside the panoramic windows for a long moment, looking across the skyline that had witnessed his rise from ambitious entrepreneur to celebrated chief executive officer. His accomplishments remained part of the company's history, and no document could erase the years of leadership that had built a global enterprise. Yet the office he had occupied had never existed independently from the governance structure supporting it. The distinction had remained invisible until the moment the structure itself was called upon to perform its purpose. Claire Kensington quietly gathered her notebook and personal belongings without speaking. Earlier that morning, she had entered the boardroom believing proximity to executive power meant participation in ownership. By evening, she understood that access and authority were not the same thing. One could be granted temporarily. The other had to be established through lawful governance and carefully preserved agreements. Amara Brooks calmly organized the original trust documents before returning them to the burgundy leather portfolio that had rested beside her throughout the day. She did not request the chief executive officer's office. She did not ask for a public statement. She did not seek recognition from the directors, now watching her with new understanding. Margaret approached and informed her that the interim leadership process would begin immediately under the Founder Governance Trust. Amara simply acknowledged the committee's decision with a courteous nod. As the directors slowly departed, the executive floor remained remarkably quiet. Employees noticed only that the annual meeting had lasted longer than expected. Most would not learn the details until the official governance announcement appeared the following morning. Nathan walked toward the boardroom doors with measured dignity. Before leaving, he turned briefly toward Amara. Neither offered words of accusation or triumph. None were necessary. Everything that needed to be said already existed within the documents resting inside the corporate archive. After the room emptied, the city lights gradually replaced the afternoon sun beyond the glass. The polished walnut table stood exactly where it had stood that morning, yet everything surrounding it had changed. Margaret switched off the final presentation screen while the corporate secretary secured the archived governance records inside the protected vault. Pierce Global would continue operating. Investors would continue investing. Employees would continue building the future. The system had not chosen sides. It had simply followed the rules entrusted to it years before. As Amara stepped toward the elevator carrying the portfolio that contained the original founder governance trust, she paused only long enough to look once across the quiet boardroom. Ownership had never left her hands. The company had merely taken an entire day to remember where it had always belonged.